Well, well, well. Welcome back, friends and comrades to Left Reckoning. Matt Leck, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing very well, David.
I'm very happy to be joined by both you, Matt, and our good friend Djene Bajalan, who is sitting in the middle of the crumbling British Empire. Djene, how are you doing, friend?
I'm doing great. It's nice to join you here from sunny Hull, on the east coast of the country, on the near what was once upon a time the longest single-span bridge in the world, but has since been pushed into sixth, seventh place. But we're still proud of it.
Hell yeah, hell yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to get into. Big election in the UK. There's a lot of kind of interesting notes. I mean, but just let's start with headlines. What happened and what's your initial reaction?
So I don't think anyone was super surprised by the results. When Rishi Sunak called this election, the polling was pretty dire for the Conservative Party. They've gone through, Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss. And now we had Rishi Sunak, who basically came to power through a kind of coup, I would say, of the Conservative Party parliamentary party and probably the City of London and those others who are concerned about the destabilizing effect of Trussonomics. So, between Boris, Truss, and now Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Party looked like it was in a complete shambles. People were super surprised when Rishi Sunak called this election when he did, because, there were some thoughts that, inflation would be down by the autumn. So, there was some thoughts that, maybe if you called the election a little bit later, because you have a law which, they changed the law a few years back, where you can't just call an election whenever you want, as prime ministers used to be able to do this kind of fixed term. So there was this thought that, he'll call it a bit later when the economic indicators are looking a bit better. He called it for now, and the result was not super surprising. Some of the more dire predictions about the Tory party, people were saying, they'll be down to 50, 60 MPs. That didn't come to pass. I didn't really think that was going to happen either. I don't think anybody really thought that's kind of just the worst case scenario. And I think there was maybe perhaps a little bit of emphasizing that amongst conservative elements of the media, especially in the BBC, which we often think of the BBC as being this kind of impartial bastion, but it is, heavily controlled by right-leaning people. I kind of thought that, if we scare people, maybe we can get people to go back to the Tory party, people who are considering voting Labour or voting for Nigel Farage's Reform Party. So the Conservatives did pretty badly. Not the worst predictions for what they, what it could have been.
Yeah, I mean, so what we're talking about here is a pretty significant trouncing, though, for the Conservative Party. How, just to give people a little bit of context, I think it's sort of important here, is that, there was a kind of merry-go-round thing going on with conservative prime ministers. And a lot of it was that they just didn't have the juice or the numbers or the vision, or, how would it be, Kirsten, your analysis, to sort of get done what maybe they want to get done. I get why it was surprising maybe that he called the election, but it was sort of inevitable at this point that they just didn't have the capacity to govern, correct?
Yeah, I think, after 14 years in power, I think the Conservative Party was an exhausted political party. They'd gone through several leaders just in one parliament, right? Several leaders in one parliament. There's very fundamental divisions in the Conservative Party. You have these kind of, more hardline cultural warrior types. And then you have the more kind of pro-business Rishi Sunak type people. And a lot of the things the Conservatives were promising to do, they weren't able to do. So let's say immigration, big issue. Mm-hmm. You can't blame Labour for, the increases in immigration that have taken place in the country. I'm not making, a case for or against immigration. It's not my politics. But, when they're saying to their base, we're going to cut immigration, but immigration is going up, mm-hmm. Who are you going to blame? There's no one to blame except for yourselves. You have really big problems in this country. I went around Tesco's in town the other day, and they've got the cheese with security tags on. They got the milk with security tags on. Mm-hmm. the inflation is like very high, and yes, people were talking about perhaps it'll be lower in the autumn, but that inflation is quite painful for people. Buying a house is really difficult. I've read different statistics, but this is one of the worst markets to buy a house in. The joke going around, the only people making money in this economy are landlords and builders, right? The only people making money. And there are these kind of new builds and these new constructions taking place, but still, you have property speculation, you have kind of people struggling, and the NHS is an absolute shambles. My brother works in the NHS, my father worked in the NHS, my mother worked in the NHS, my sister-in-law works in the NHS, and they'll all tell you there's like a really big fundamental crisis in the NHS. And there's knock-on effects, for example, from the beggaring of the university system. Like, they increased tuition, they increased loans, so now you have junior doctors coming out with big amounts of debt, and the pay is not fantastic. You'd be surprised how low it is. One thing, a junior doctor, like a junior doctor can't aspire to, like, even if you have junior doctors in your society not being able to aspire to like a middle class life, or having like a great deal of difficulties getting paid minimum wage for their work, there's going to be a lot of discontent, not just from low propensity voters, but from like the kind of core voters in British society. So there's a lot of fundamental problems in this society, and there's a lot of disillusionment in this society. Like, there was just endless ridiculous scandals taking place. So there was a scandal where a bunch of Conservative MPs had like placed bets on the election, right, when the election would be taking place. And then was like, wait, did they know, and did they just like scam people? So it's just been a really kind of like gloomy and kind of pathetic election. Labour didn't win this huge mandate. Like, the reason Labour's majority, and I think I might be wrong on this, I think it's not quite as big actually as Tony Blair's landslide in 1997, but it's a big electoral majority. But it reflects the kind of vagaries of the British first past the post electoral system. It's one of the most distorted election results in British history. First past the post is already not a great system, but in this particular political environment where you have like a great deal of disillusionment with establishment political parties, this first past the post system, just produced a very undemocratic result. People might be glad to have got rid of the Tories, but if we look at the proportion of the vote, over the last election in which Jeremy Corbyn lost that election quite heavily, how much did Labour increase their vote share by? 1.6%. So like the struggle against, Corbyn's Hitlerism yielded what? 1.6% increase of the vote. But of course, that doesn't matter at the end of the day. It did yield Keir Starmer a huge electoral victory. But does that mean that they have a mandate? Because I think what's going to happen is you have this big majority, but the Labour government is not coming in on a wave of popularity, right? It's coming in a kind of wave of cynicism towards the existing political establishment, and the big winners in these elections, even though in an absolute sense they still aren't gaining what they should. As you got the Liberal Party going up from like I think 10 to 71 MPs. You have Reform Party getting 4 MPs, which they'd never got any MPs before, despite having only a few million votes less than the Conservative Party. So you have this kind of divided electorate. And my prediction is actually this is not a signal of like now we're going to be in like permanent Labour government. Depending on what happens, I think you're going to have like wild swings because all this is based on very small numbers of the vote.
Well, I mean, just to take one of those issues, what is Keir Starmer's Labour going to do to address the issues of the NHS? Like, and what would maybe a Jeremy Corbyn's hypothetical alternate reality Labour Party be doing to address those problems?
Well, this has been one of the things about the election campaign. People have been like, well, what are the what are the policies? It's been a light on policy. Keir Starmer has like not really said that much about policy. There's going to be additional spending in the NHS. They're going to prioritize waiting lists in the NHS. But the real question is like, okay, how exactly? Where's the money going to come from? Where's like what procedures is this going to go through? There are like real structural issues in the NHS, especially as Britain has an aging population, and you have a whole load of knock-on kind of problems that have been building up for years. Like, for example, as you have an aging population, we don't have convalescent homes anymore, which were like I think you call them outpatient hospitals in America, where like you don't need like an intense hospital bed, but you've just had a surgery, you go there and someone keeps an eye on you, right? We don't have those ones anymore. We have people, you have this crisis in beds, you have a crisis in staffing, the pay is terrible, inflation is high. So what are they going to do? I mean, I guess what they could do immediately is like pump money into getting doctors to do what they call locums, waiting list initiatives. This is what the Blair government did back in the day, where, they would just say to a doctor, we'll pay you a shit ton of money. Just go to, my father was a medical doctor. He would go to Northern Ireland and he would do a bunch of things in Northern Ireland to get their waiting list down and things like that. So do those kind of things. But the real question is, like, are you going to be addressing the real deep structural problems with social care, which is like a big issue in this country? Like, how are we going to deal with this aging population? How are we going to get all these old people who are like taking up hospital beds, who don't really need the hospital beds, but they can't really go home and look after themselves. So there's like real problems there. So Labour has it's said that waiting lists are a priority. That's one of the big things that's going on. But like, what else are they going to do? Like, what are going to be the big structural reforms taking place? Are they going to further privatize the NHS? Are they going to do more of these public-private partnerships? Are they going to roll those back and things like that? With the Corbyn administration, I think it would have been quite clear there would have been a lot more like just money pumped into it through and perhaps rolling back of the way that some of the services are provided. So, for example, like I think in Hull, and maybe wrong about this, but the people who deliver the blood between the Hull Royal Infirmary and the Castle Hill Hospital, that's a private company that does that. Like you could envision that like a Corbyn government would have kind of brought those kind of things back away from for profit, providing more of these for profit services and things like that. But, we'll see what the Labour government does. But yeah, waiting list is going to be a big priority because the waiting lists are, back when I first moved to America, I used to be like, I'm really worried about healthcare in America. If something happens, I'll go back to the UK. Now, I mean, because I have a good insurance, obviously if you don't have good insurance, you're kind of screwed in America. But because I have good insurance, it's like, well, actually, I'm probably better off in America because I might, if it's like something not super emergency, I might be on a waiting list for ages and something else comes up. Some real problems like getting even a GP meeting or finding an NHS dentist, for example. That's another thing that's really difficult to do. And it's, these things have always been quite difficult in Britain. It's not been like the land of milk and honey that everybody thinks it is, but they have got like markedly worse. And as someone who I come back to Britain and spend like 2-3 months every year in Britain, I have enough time to kind of see what the changes are, but also have like a gap between them. Mm-hmm. And it's like, the deterioration has been quite noticeable. And more just generally, the Conservatives after Brexit promised things like leveling up other parts of the country. Britain is like hugely disproportionately orientated towards the southwest, right? Sorry, towards the southeast of the country. And there was a lot of hope that, with Brexit, that like there'll be this leveling up money for the rest of the country. I mean, some places have done really well. Leeds, Manchester, those places have got a lot of money in them. But now, obviously, house prices there are ridiculous and nobody can afford houses there. But the rest of the places are left on kind of rack and ruin, right? Mm-hmm. Like you see like infrastructure deteriorating, things run down. You walk around town in Hull, which is not a small city, like everything's like closed and there's like gambling places everywhere. It's just pretty glum as it is. Like one of the biggest employers, I think, in the center of town is like Westcott, which is a debt collection agency, which like half my friends work for now because that's like the main employer.
Oh, Lord. Well, Gene, I wanted to actually talk to you a little bit about the shifts and Brexit. But if you're here listening on the free version, you're going to have to sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning to be able to hear the rest of this interview. But without that out of the way, Gene, I mean, like, the thing that's sort of funny, like, tell me if I'm wrong, is that, the UK, like a lot of countries, has gone through